Edrin Cole froze in the middle of drift-plain fields, his boots sinking into the damp soil as the sky of Veyra Prime ripped itself apart. A tier of fire split the clouds, and massive warships, shapes he had only seen on old Terran broadcasts, thundered through the heavens like predators in pursuit. Their engines scorched the dusk with trails of molten light, and the wind carried the smell of ozone and burning metal. The ground trembled beneath him. A distant blast flared across the horizon, turning the silver rice fields into a sea of molten bronze. Birds shrieked and burst out of the irrigation canals, spiraling into the darkening sky, vanishing into the thick smoke now bleeding from the clouds. Then, the war truly arrived. A Kryn Dominion fighter dove low, its black, jagged hull glinting like obsidian as it screamed past. Plasma fire stitched the air in emerald lines, striking at a Terran Vanguard carrier lumbering through the sky. The carrier answered with bursts of orange light, and for a moment the battle over the quiet fields became a storm of color and death. Fire against fire, shadow against shadow. The shockwave hit next. Edrin staggered as the blast rolled across the fields, flattening rice stalks in a wave. Heat washed over him, carrying the taste of iron on his tongue. His chest vibrated with the roar, his hands gripping the plow to keep from falling. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a wounded warship spinning out of the clouds, trailing fire and black smoke. It turned as it fell, catching the last light of the dying sun. For a heartbeat, it looked like a star breaking apart, tumbling toward his tiny, helpless world. Then the sky rained cinders. Ash spiraled down in ghostly flurries, and the soft hiss of burning debris filled the air. Edrin stood frozen, his quiet life shattered in an instant, as the war he had only known from distant whispers finally touched the soil of driftplain fields. Edrin Cole gripped the wooden plow, knuckles white, as the echoes of the explosions rolled across driftplain fields. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal and wet soil, and somewhere in the distance, another blast rumbled like an angry god clearing its throat. He forced his legs to move, stepping slowly through the flattened rice stalks. Every sound felt sharper now. The crackle of burning debris, the whistle of the wind sliding over the empty fields, the frantic wing beats of the last few birds still fleeing the chaos above. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat reminding him how small and mortal he was. Through the smoke, he could see Ashfall Hamlet, just a faint silhouette on the horizon. The rooftops glimmered under the fiery reflection of the sky like tiny candles about to be snuffed out. He thought of the people there, the shopkeepers, the miller's family, old Mira with her stubborn herd of grain beasts. And he knew they were watching the same sky, probably praying it would all pass them by. Another streak of plasma tore across the clouds, and instinctively, Edrin dropped into a crouch, his boots sinking into the mud. His breath came fast and shallow. He felt the old primal fear, the kind that had nothing to do with reason or courage, creep up his spine. He was a farmer, a man who tilled the earth and counted the seasons. He had no place in the wars of empires and aliens. Above him, the night was unraveling. He could see the Terran Vanguard carrier lurch under a hail of enemy fire, its shields flickering like dying lightning bugs. A pair of Kryn Dominion fighters swept past in perfect formation, their hulls reflecting the infernal glow of the clouds. Edrin swallowed hard and straightened, though his hands trembled. He had survived storms and droughts. But this was different. The war wasn't on some distant star anymore. It was here, bleeding fire and ash into his last quiet corner of the galaxy. And deep down, he knew that after tonight, driftplain fields would never be the same. The world held its breath. High above the fields, the Terran Vanguard carrier buckled under another barrage of plasma fire. Its hull glowed in fractured lines, each explosion cracking through the night, like the drumbeats of war. For a heartbeat, the massive ship seemed to hang motionless against the darkened clouds. Then gravity claimed it. The carrier began to fall. Edrin Cole stood frozen, his heart hammering so hard he could barely hear. The ship tumbled end over end, a burning titan, tearing rifts of smoke across the sky. Panels and shattered armor plating peeled away as it descended, spinning like deadly shrapnel. One wing section ripped free, blazing like a comet before vanishing into the horizon. The sound came next, a roar that grew from a distant rumble to a deafening scream, shaking the soil beneath drift-plain fields. Birds fled in panicked bursts. Water in the irrigation canals rippled and splashed against the banks. The entire world seemed to vibrate with the ship's death spiral. Edrin threw himself behind the plow as the carrier hit the earth. The impact split the night in half. A bloom of fire rose taller than any grain silo, lighting the horizon with hellish brilliance. The shockwaves slammed into Edrin a moment later, ripping his hat from his head and throwing him onto his side. The ground beneath him quivered, and a wall of heat rolled over the field. Then came the rain of cinders. Ash and debris spiraled through the air, carried by the winds of the explosion. Tiny embers danced like ghostly fireflies, hissing as they touched the wet rice stalks. Charred fragments of metal rained down, some clattering into the irrigation canals, others sticking into the mud like blackened arrows. Smoke drifted low, hugging the earth, and every breath tasted of iron and burnt oil. Through the haze, Edrin pushed himself up, blinking against the stinging wind. His field, the one he had spent years tending, was no longer a field at all. It was a wasteland of trampled stalks, streaks of fire, and an enormous crater still steaming in the distance. Flames licked the jagged edges of the wreck, where the remains of the Starfall wreck glowed faintly through the smoke. The sky rumbled again as if mocking him, and for the first time since the chaos began, Edrin truly felt small. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was the hand of war, and it had crushed everything it touched. A sharp metallic clang rang out behind him. Edrin spun, heart racing, just in time to see a hunk of blackened hull slice into the mud where he had been standing. Moments ago, he stumbled back, realizing that staying here meant death, yet some part of him couldn't leave. The sight was mesmerizing, terrifying. Embers swirled like dying stars around him as he whispered to no one, his voice lost in the wind. God, help us all. The night had gone eerily quiet after the fall. Only the faint crackle of flames and the soft hiss of settling ash broke the stillness. Edrin Cole forced his legs to move, drawn toward the glow in the distance. Smoke curled off, the ruined Starfall wreck, twisting in the moonlight like phantom hands. The heat hit him before he was even close, a rolling wave that dried the sweat on his face and carried the metallic tang of scorched steel. He waded through the flattened rice stalks, boots squelching in the mud, until he reached the edge of the crater. The earth had split open, a jagged wound in the middle of drift-plain fields, still steaming from the impact. Sparks flickered along the broken hull where molten seams cooled slowly under the night sky. Up close, the wreck was colossal. Whole sections of the Terran Vanguard carrier had sheared away, leaving a skeleton of blackened ribs and shattered plating. He could see parts of the engine core, glowing faintly like dying embers. Steam rose in ghostly tendrils from the smoldering. Metal, and every step closer felt like approaching the mouth of some slumbering beast. Edrin paused, scanning the wreck. For a moment he swore he saw movement, a flicker of shadow between the twisted beams. His hand instinctively gripped the old harvesting hook hanging from his belt, though he knew it would do nothing against whatever came from the stars. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid scent of burnt oil and something else, something sharp, alien, and faintly sweet. It made the hair on his arms rise. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch a piece of the hull. The metal was warm, almost pulsing under his palm. He could hear faint creaks, like the groans of a dying animal, and deeper still, a rhythmic hum that didn't sound natural. Then, from somewhere inside the wreck, came a sound so soft he almost missed it. A shiver ran through him as he froze, listening. A muffled noise, high and trembling, echoing faintly through the jagged corridors of the ruined ship. It was a cry. Edrin Cole froze on the edge of the crater, his breath clouding in. The cool night air. The muffled cry rose again from within the Starfall wreck, threading through the smoke and the low groan of cooling metal. It was faint, trembling, and unmistakably alive. His pulse hammered in his ears. He hesitated only a moment before sliding down the muddy slope, boots skidding on wet soil. The heat grew harsher as he approached the jagged opening of the wreck, each step crunching over shards of scorched metal and glass. Sparks flared under his soles, and a bitter scent of oil and burnt circuitry clung to the air. Inside the broken hull, shadows twisted in the flicker of small fires. Wires hung like dead vines, some sparking faintly, illuminating the curved walls in brief, ghostly flashes. Edrin paused, straining to hear over the groans of the dying ship. There it was again, soft, stuttering, a sound that did not belong to war or machines. A child's cry. His chest tightened. The noise came from deeper within, past a tangle of bent support beams and a wall of shattered panels. Crouching, he ducked into the narrow corridor, the heat pressing against his skin. Every step echoed, magnified in the hollow wreck. He passed a console blinking weakly, its cracked screen spilling alien symbols and fractured light. Then he saw it. Nestled among the debris, half hidden beneath a torn emergency blanket, was a small figure. Tiny arms trembled in the firelight. Pale skin shimmered with a faint, almost iridescent hue, and a trace of silver hair clung damply to its head. Its eyes, large, luminous, and not entirely human, blinked up at him through the haze. Edrin's breath caught. A child, but not a human child. The baby whimpered, curling against the ruined metal as the wreck shuddered under some distant rumble in the night. Instinct overrode fear. Edrin crouched lower, his rough farmer's hands trembling as he reached out, the weight of everything, the war, the fire, the ash, suddenly collapsing into the fragile sound of a single life crying for help. Far above, the skies of Veyra Prime burned on, but in that crater, only the small, luminous eyes of the child held him, and with that, the last quiet piece of Edrin Cole's life was gone. Edrin Cole knelt at the jagged opening of the Starfall wreck, the heat of scorched metal rolling against his face like a furnace. The smoke was thick, laced with the bitter tang of burning fuel and something sweetly alien, making every breath a gamble. His calloused hands gripped the twisted frame as he leaned forward, peering into the shadowy interior of the broken ship. The inside was a maze of flickering firelight and warped steel. Wires drooped like charred vines. Pools of molten alloy reflected the orange glow of the fires, turning the corridor into a pulsing, metallic heart. He could hear the distant creak of the hull, the soft whisper of ash falling onto cooling plates. But beneath it all, there was movement. Something shifted in the gloom. He ducked through the opening, his boots crunching on shattered panels. The air inside was stifling, but he pressed on, one careful step at a time, guided by a fragile, stuttering sound. A cry, faint and high-pitched, broke through the hum of the dying vessel. Then he saw it. In the hollow of a broken support frame, tucked beneath a scorched emergency blanket, lay a child. Its small chest rose and fell rapidly, trembling against the cold air. Pale skin caught the firelight, glimmering with a subtle iridescence, and tufts of silver hair clung to its damp forehead. But it was the eyes, those luminous, wide eyes, that rooted Idran to the spot. They glowed with a soft inner light, neither fully human nor fully alien, reflecting the chaos around them like twin stars caught in a storm. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. This was no ordinary survivor. This was something from the whispers he had only half believed. The convergence, the impossible rumor of a child born of two worlds. The baby whimpered, the sound fragile against the vast ruin of the ship. Instinct warred with terror in Idran's chest. He had spent his life tending to crops on drift-plain fields, fighting nothing but weeds and the endless loneliness of his small farm. Yet here, amid smoke and ruin, a life looked up at him, waiting. Outside, the wind carried the hiss of settling ash across Veyra Prime, and somewhere in the distance, a Strykar drone hummed faintly, searching. Idran's fingers trembled as he reached out, the heat of the wreck and the cold weight of fate pressing against him all at once. The child blinked slowly, and in that single, unspoken moment, his quiet world was gone. Idran staggered out of the starfall wreck, cradling the small body against his chest. The rain of ash clung to his sweat-damp shirt, painting him in ghostly gray. Every step across the drift-plain fields felt heavier than the last, as though the planet itself knew the weight of the secret he carried. The child was warm, faintly trembling, and unnervingly quiet now. Its luminous eyes fluttered closed. But the soft hum from the ether beacon around its neck pulsed against Idran's arm. He flinched at every distant echo. Was that the wind, or the low whir of a Strykar drone? Shadows twisted along the edges of the abandoned irrigation lines, and the scorched silhouettes of wheat stalks seemed like fingers reaching for him. By the time he reached the edges of the last field, his breath came in ragged bursts. The outline of his farmhouse rose through the fog of ash, a lonely silhouette against the dim horizon. He hesitated at the fence, his boots sinking into the soft, blackened soil. This was his refuge, the last place untouched by the chaos above. But bringing the child here would change everything. He pressed the baby closer, feeling its fragile heartbeat through the fabric. Images of his late wife flickered in his mind, the way she had once held a stray animal with the same instinctive tenderness. He had buried love along with her years ago, convincing himself he was done with fragile things. And yet, his hands wouldn't let go. Inside, the house was quiet, smelling faintly of smoke and earth. He laid the child on a worn blanket near the hearth, then bolted the shutters tight. Kneeling there in the flickering lamplight, Idran finally allowed the fear to come. This child wasn't just a survivor, it was a living beacon, a target. If the Terran Vanguard or the Kryn Dominion discovered it here, his entire life, and perhaps Ashfall Hamlet itself, could burn. The baby stirred, letting out a soft, questioning coo, and Idran's chest tightened. He whispered to himself, barely, audible over the wind scraping the walls, "I'll keep you safe. Somehow." The first sign of danger was the vibration under the floorboards. Idran froze, his rough hands hovering over the tiny bundle on the blanket. Through the walls of his farmhouse, a low hum resonated like the growl of some great metal predator. He knew that sound, Strykar drones, sweeping patterns over the fields, hunting for anything that didn't belong. He darted to the shuttered window, peeking through the narrow slit. Out beyond the last field, lights skimmed the horizon, cutting through the ash-laden twilight. A formation of drones floated silently over drift-plain fields, their glowing lenses scanning the earth with cold precision. And above them, two Terran Vanguard patrol skimmers glided low, their dark hulls bristling with sensor arrays. Idran's pulse hammered in his ears. They were looking for survivors, or worse, witnesses. He turned to the child. Lyrics. The soft glow of the ether beacon around the baby's neck flickered in rhythm with its shallow breaths. Edrin's chest clenched. That little pulse was a beacon for anyone with the right scanners. He snatched up a thick wool blanket and wrapped the baby tight, tucking the faint light against his chest. A sudden beam of blue light swept across his home, crawling along the fence and sliding up the walls like a ghostly hand. Edrin ducked instinctively, pressing his back to the wall. He held his breath. The hum of the drones grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat circling closer. Then came the voices. "Sector clear. Wait. I'm reading residual energy from the wreck," said a clipped, metallic tone outside. The translation filter of a Vanguard scout. "Command wants confirmation. Check the village. Kryn sensors picked up a life sign spike before impact." Edrin's stomach dropped. They were coming to Ashfall Hamlet. With slow, deliberate movements, he slipped into the root cellar beneath the floor. Dust fell into his hair as he pried the trapdoor open and climbed down, careful to cradle Lyrics against him. The cellar smelled of soil and old grain. He crouched in the shadows, the faint rumble of engines above vibrating through the beams. A sharp clang rattled the ceiling, the sound of boots on his porch. Edrin held his breath as light spilled through the cracks in the floorboards, moving, in precise, hunting arcs. The muffled thump of a drone landing outside shook the walls. Then a high-pitched ping from the ether beacon pierced the silence. Lyric stirred, letting out a small, plaintive cry. Edrin's heart seized. He pressed the baby gently to his chest, praying the blanket would dampen the sound. Above, the footsteps paused. He could hear faint voices, confused, searching, but, after a long, breathless moment, the light shifted away. The footsteps retreated. Engines roared, and one by one the sounds of the patrol faded into the ash-thick night. Only then did Edrin exhale, trembling in the darkness. He looked down at the glowing eyes peeking from the blanket and whispered, "We don't have long. They'll be back." The night deepened over Ashfall Hamlet, a restless silence broken only by the wind scraping ash along the farmhouse walls. Edrin sat on the creaking floorboards, his back against the cold stone hearth, the weight of exhaustion pulling at his limbs. Across from him, on a patchwork blanket, the child, Lyrics, stared at the firelight with wide, unblinking eyes. Edrin rubbed his face with calloused hands, muttering to himself, "What in all the stars am I supposed to do with you?" He had survived years alone in the last field, weathering storms, loneliness, and even the occasional dust raid from the wilds. But this was different. This wasn't a season he could simply wait out. The air shifted. Edrin froze. A strange warmth rippled through his thoughts, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He blinked, glancing at the child. Lyrics's glowing eyes were fixed on him, and for a moment he swore he heard a whisper, not with his ears, but deep inside his head. Safe. The word wasn't human, yet it carried the shape of human meaning. Edrin's breath caught. He leaned closer, heart pounding. "Was that you?" Lyrics tilted its head, the silver strands of hair catching the flicker of the firelight. The ether beacon at its neck glowed softly in rhythm with its slow, steady breaths. Another pulse, stronger this time, swept through Edrin's mind, like a memory that wasn't his. In an instant, he felt the chaos of the battle above, ships tearing through clouds, energy fire splitting the sky, fear that was not his own, and a fierce, wordless instinct to survive. His vision blurred with images of a vast metallic chamber, rows of pods and voices, human and alien, overlapping, in an echo of desperate planning. The convergence wasn't just a rumor, it was real, and this child was its proof. Edrin staggered back, clutching his head as the visions faded. Lyrics blinked once, and the farmhouse returned to stillness, the fire popping quietly in the hearth. I can feel you, he whispered, his voice a mix of awe and dread. The baby cooed softly, reaching one small hand toward him. Edrin hesitated, then extended a trembling finger. Lyrex grasped it with surprising strength, and another wave of warmth rushed through him. An unspoken promise, a bond forming in the quiet heart of a broken world. But beneath that warmth was a current of danger. In his mind's eye, he saw shadows, moving across the fields, lights cutting through the dark, hunting. The child's connection was a gift, but it also meant he was no longer invisible. From somewhere outside, a distant rumble rolled across driftplain fields. Edron's pulse quickened. He glanced at the bolted shutters and then back to the child, whose eyes glimmered like twin stars in the dim room. "You're going to get us both killed," he said softly, though he couldn't bring himself to let go. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, painting the farmhouse in shades of red and shadow. Edrin dozed upright against the wall, his old Helios pulse rifle leaning across his knees. He hadn't truly slept since the wreck fell. Every creak of the boards, every whisper of wind over the last field kept his body tense, ready to spring. A soft chime pulled him from the edge of sleep. At first he thought it was a dream. Then the sound came again. Ping, ping, a delicate but unmistakable tone. His eyes snapped open. Lyrex lay on the blanket, wide awake. The ether beacon at the child's neck pulsed with a new, urgent light, the glow washing over the walls like liquid moonlight. Edrin's stomach dropped. He crawled forward, hands shaking, and tried to shield the device with the folds of the blanket. "Quiet, little star," he whispered, heart hammering. "They'll hear you." The beacon ignored him. Its glow intensified, sending faint threads of light curling into the air like smoke. Edrin had seen beacons used by the Terran Vanguard before, but this was different. It wasn't just transmitting. It was searching. Then he felt it, like a chill under his skin, a vibration that wasn't sound but meaning, resonating deep in his chest. Lyrex's eyes mirrored the same rhythm, and Edrin knew without words, someone, somewhere was calling. He stumbled to the window, peering into the ash-veiled night. Across driftplain fields, faint points of light flickered in the sky, moving in deliberate formation. They were too distant to tell whose they were, but the hair on the back of his neck rose. Kryn or Vanguard, or worse, something he didn't recognize. The beacon pulsed faster, almost like a heartbeat in panic. Then the farmhouse lights, what few he had, flickered and died. For a breathless second, the world was only the glow of the child and the heavy sound of Edrin's pulse. He crouched by Lyrex, torn between smashing the device and protecting the child from whatever was coming. But before he could act, the pulsing slowed. The light condensed into a single steady glow, and then, in his mind, a whisper. "They are coming." Edron's blood ran cold. He lifted the rifle and glanced toward the dark horizon, every instinct screaming that his quiet life on Veyra Prime was gone forever. Somewhere beyond the fields, a distant rumble rolled across the night. The night over driftplain fields was too quiet. Edrin Cole crouched on the edge of the last field, the damp soil clinging to his boots, heart drumming a rhythm that felt older than fear itself. He had lived through storms, droughts, and the silent grief of losing his wife. But nothing prepared him for the faint hum that began to tremble through the ground. It was low, almost like a heartbeat, vibrating through the earth until it rose into a predatory whine. A shadow cut across the moonlight, sharp and mechanical. Edrin froze, holding Lyrex tighter against his chest. The child's strange eyes glimmered, in the darkness, reflecting a light that wasn't there yet. Then it came, A searing beam of blue light lanced down from the hovering Striker drone, slicing the field into bright and dark, turning the stalks of grain into ghostly silver. The drone moved slowly, methodically, its wings whispering in the air like knives scraping stone. Edrin could see the insignia of the Kryn Dominion stenciled on its underside, a stark symbol against the metal hull. It was hunting. He shifted lower, crawling through the mud to reach the thin cover of the collapsed irrigation channel. Lyrax clung to him silently, but Edrin could feel the subtle tremor in the child's body, fear, or perhaps something else. The light swept past them once, twice, each pass lingering a heartbeat longer as if tasting the air. Then the sound changed. A metallic click. The drone descended, hovering just meters above the soil, and a ripple of energy spread across the field like heat over desert stone. Edrin's skin prickled. He realized it was scanning for life, for something that didn't belong. Lyrax's breathing quickened, and suddenly the child pressed its tiny hand to Edrin's chest. A warmth pulsed through him, soft but insistent, as if the child's heartbeat was syncing with his. He dared not move, dared not even swallow, while the drone floated closer. For one agonizing minute, all he could hear was the faint hum of machinery and the drum of his own pulse. Then, without warning, the light swept past them one last time, and shifted away, sliding across the far end of driftplain fields toward the black horizon. Edrin exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knew this was just the beginning. Whatever the Kryn Dominion was looking for, it was here, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. Edrin Cole moved with the instinct of a hunted animal, crouched low as he darted between the stalks of driftplain fields. The faint whir of the Striker drone still echoed in the night, fading and returning like a predator circling its prey. Lyrax clung to his neck, light but trembling, their small fingers pressing into the collar of his worn shirt. Every breath Edrin took felt like it might betray them to the sky. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its silhouette warped against the fractured moonlight. He slipped through the back door without a sound, the hinges long since oiled for nights just like this. Nights he'd never imagined would come. The smell of grain and earth embraced him, a fleeting comfort in the storm of his fear. "Quiet," he whispered, though the child hadn't made a sound. Lyrax only watched him with those luminous eyes that seemed to know too much. He crossed the main room and reached the old hatch under the pantry floor. With a grunt, he heaved it open, the wood creaking softly as cool air rose from the darkness below. This cellar had once stored the harvest. Now it was a hole for survival. He lowered himself down the ladder, one rung at a time until his boots touched packed soil. The grain cellar smelled of dust and memory. Stacks of burlap bags lined the walls, and old tools lay where he had left them years ago. Edrin crouched low, pulling Lyrax against him as he listened. Above, the distant hum grew louder again, followed by the guttural roar of engines passing directly overhead. The drone was not alone anymore. He could hear a formation now, 3, maybe 4, Striker drones sweeping the area. Through the narrow cracks in the floorboards, pale light filtered down, thin and cold. A beam lingered for a heartbeat, and Edrin's breath caught in his throat. He pressed Lyrax close, his hand instinctively covering the child's head as if shielding them from. The light could make them invisible. Then the sound shifted, louder, angrier. The engines dipped, and for a terrifying moment it felt as though the drones hovered directly above the farmhouse. Lyrax gripped his shirt tighter, their tiny chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. In the heavy silence, Edrin could hear his own heart pounding. He knew that if the Dominion scouts detected the faint biosignature of this child, everything he had left, this house, his land, his life, would burn under their plasma fire. Minutes dragged like hours. Eventually, the engines roared away, fading into the distance, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the soft patter of loose dust settling from the ceiling beams. Edrin let out a shuddering breath. He dared a glance at Lyrix, who met his gaze with something unspoken. Fear, yes, but also an awareness beyond their years. The night was far from over. The first warning was the tremor, a faint vibration through the packed soil beneath the grain cellar. Edrin Cole froze, his back pressed to the cool earth wall. Lyrix clung to him in silence, their luminous eyes glinting in the faint light seeping through the cracks. Then the sound came, a rising metallic whine, sharper than before, followed by the low rumble of engines circling close. The Strykar drones were back. Edrin's gut tightened. He had lived through storms, fire, and famine, but nothing compared to the predator's patience of these machines. They weren't just searching, they were hunting. A flash of light burst through the cracks above, sweeping across the cellar like a blade. Dust floated in the sudden brilliance, and Edrin saw the outline of his own fingers trembling as he shielded Lyrix. The beam passed once, then twice, then lingered. He could almost hear the drone thinking, calculating. Then came the shriek of an alarm, an alien tone that pierced through the floorboards, vibrating in his chest. "They've got us," he muttered under his breath. The first blast hit a second later. A shockwave rattled the house, knocking burlap bags from the shelves and sending tools clattering across the floor. Lyrix flinched, but didn't cry, as if some instinct told them that sound could mean death. The second blast followed immediately, splintering wood and showering the cellar in dirt. Edrin wrapped his arms around the child and dove behind a stack of grain sacks as another explosion tore through the side of the farmhouse. He could hear the whirring of the drone's cannons, the crackle of ignited wood, and the hiss of burning straw. The smell of scorched earth filled the cellar. One corner of the ceiling gave way, a beam snapping with a tortured groan. Sunless. Daylight, gray and cold under the smoke-filled sky, spilled into the cellar as chunks of timber crashed to the floor. Dust engulfed them, choking and blinding. For a moment, Edrin thought it was over. He thought the next blast would reduce the entire house to splinters and bury them alive. Then, through the chaos, he felt it. A pulse, a vibration not from the drones, but from Lyrix. The child's small body trembled, and a soft hum rose from the ether beacon around their neck. Light pulsed against his chest where Lyrix pressed close, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. "Stop," Edrin whispered, though he knew it wasn't the child's choice. The drones seemed to respond instantly. The whine of engines grew frenzied, and a streak of plasma scorched the field outside. Through the jagged hole in the floorboards, Edrin could see fire licking the edges of driftplane fields. His crops, his livelihood, his last tether to the life he'd built with his late wife, turning to ash under the rain of cinders. Then, silence. No engines, no beams. Just the distant crackle of burning wood and the falling patter of smoldering straw. Edrin coughed and pushed himself upright, brushing soot and dirt from his hair. The child's eyes glowed faintly in the gloom, wide with something between terror and sorrow. "They know," he said, voice hoarse. "They know you're here." Above, the ruin of the farmhouse groaned under its own weight. A section of the barn had collapsed entirely, and smoke drifted upward to the darkening sky. Edrin knew it was only a matter of time before the drones returned with reinforcements, or worse, a full Dominion strike team. He wiped the sweat and grime from his face, heart pounding, and tightened his grip on Lyrix. "We can't stay here," he whispered. "Not anymore." The night had turned against them. The farm that had once been his sanctuary was now a beacon for death. The fire in the fields had faded to smoldering embers by nightfall, leaving driftplane fields cloaked in smoke and shadows. Edrin Cole crouched beneath the fractured roof of the grain cellar, his muscles stiff and trembling from hours of silence. Beside him, Lyrics sat on a stack of spilled burlap, knees drawn to their chest, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Edrin had always thought of himself as a man of the soil, not a man of words. He had spoken little since his wife died. But now, with the house half destroyed and death circling in the sky, he needed answers. "Who are you, really?" he asked quietly.
"What are they looking for?"
Lyrics tilted their head, as if parsing the meaning of his voice more than the words themselves. Then slowly, images, not words, began to bloom in Edrin's mind. It wasn't magic, exactly. It was more like a dream shared through a half-forgotten doorway. He saw a Terran Vanguard pilot, visor cracked and eyes bloodshot, wrestling a burning shuttle through a storm of laser fire. A woman, no, not quite human, sat beside him, her silver hair whipping wildly in the cockpit. Her eyes glowed the same way Lyrix's did, bright and alien, yet gentle as they turned toward the man she loved. The shuttle pitched violently. The image fractured. Edrin gasped. "Your parents?" Lyrix nodded, small fingers clutching his sleeve. The next vision struck sharper, as if the memory itself carried pain. A sleek Dominion warship loomed in the void, flanked by swarms of Strykar, drones. He saw flashes of light, heard muffled screams, felt the panic of a desperate flight. Then, darkness and the echo of a heartbeat not his own. "They were running," Edrin murmured. "From both sides?" A trembling nod. He felt another fragment, jagged and cold, a metallic chamber with tubes and lights, symbols etched into walls he didn't understand. The sense of confinement, of being watched, of being studied. Somewhere in the background, he glimpsed the words, "the convergence," not spoken, not written in his language, but carved into his thoughts with a clarity that made his stomach knot. Edrin pulled the child closer, half to comfort them, half to steady himself. "They made you part of some plan." Lyrix's eyes dimmed slightly, as if weighed by a truth even they couldn't fully hold. In that moment, Edrin realized the war raging above his farm wasn't just a battle over territory. It was a battle over existence itself, over whether children like Lyrix had the right to breathe under any sky. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of burned wheat and scorched earth. The night was alive with distant engines, a reminder that the Kryn Dominion and the Terran Vanguard were still circling like vultures, waiting for a sign of life. "Listen to me," Edrin said, his voice rough but steady. "I don't care what they planned. You're here now. You're not a weapon. You're just a child." For the first time, Lyrix leaned against his shoulder, warm and trembling. He felt a pulse from the ether beacon. Slower now, less frantic. Edrin looked toward the shattered roof and the dark sky beyond. The next move wouldn't be survival by accident. It would be survival by choice. He wasn't sure he could save this child from a war between the stars, but he knew he'd die trying. And somewhere, buried under layers of fear and fatigue, a quiet resolve began to grow in him. A resolve he hadn't felt since the day he'd lost his family. The night sky over Veyra Prime had never looked like this. Edrin Cole stood in the ruins of his farmhouse, splinters and ash crunching under his boots. Above him, the stars seemed to tremble, their light broken by the black silhouettes of colossal ships. First came a single shape, its hull bristling with antennae and siege cannons, then another and another, until the heavens themselves seemed to sink under the weight of metal. The Terran Vanguard fleet had arrived, and opposite them, sliding into view from the east, came the jagged forms of Kryn Dominion warships, their thrusters burning a cold blue that painted the clouds like ghost fire. Edrin's breath caught. This wasn't a skirmish anymore. This was the beginning of an all-out war, the kind that would leave the soil poisoned and the rivers dry. Behind him, Lyrics climbed over the debris of the shattered barn, eyes wide. They didn't need to speak. The child's glowing gaze mirrored the awe and dread he felt in his bones. For a fleeting second, the boy or girl, he still wasn't sure, looked like part of that alien sky, as if they belonged up there, somewhere, among the warships and distant suns. The first rain of cinders began to fall as the fleets maneuvered. Not from burning crops this time, but from the upper atmosphere, where drones and gunships were already colliding in streaks of fire. Ash and frost mixed in the night air, and every few seconds, the ground shivered under the distant thrum of mass drivers charging to fire. Edrin staggered back as a low, throbbing hum rolled across the fields. One of the Dominion carriers, longer than 10 farmsteads end to end, descended enough for its shadow to swallow the last field completely. Its hull bristled with Strykar drones, thousands of them detaching like a swarm of metal hornets. On the other side of the sky, a Vanguard dreadnought angled its cannons toward the intruders, and for a moment, Edrin thought he could almost feel the standoff, the taut breath of two predators ready to strike. Lyrics clutched his hand. In their other hand, the ether beacon pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat synced to the rhythms of the war above. Edrin didn't know if that meant safety or doom. A flare cut across the sky, red, then blue, then white, a signal of some kind. And then the universe roared. Every ship in orbit seemed to move at once. Drones screamed through the atmosphere, leaving vapor trails like spiderwebs across the stars. Plasma cannons fired, lighting the fields in electric blues and violent oranges. The concussion of the first broadside hit like a physical blow, knocking Edrin to one knee. He shielded Lyrics with his arms as chunks of frozen dirt and burning debris rained around them. He realized with a cold clarity that the war was no longer above. It was here. His home was nothing but an intersection in a battle that could erase a planet. Somewhere deep in his chest, the farmer in him wanted to run. But the man who had taken in a strange, trembling child knew there was no running anymore. There was only surviving, one heartbeat at a time. And as the fleets of giants clashed over drift-plain fields, Edrin Cole felt the ground shake and knew that his life and the fate of Lyrics had just been swallowed by the war. The sky above drift-plain fields had turned into a furnace. Ash drifted in slow spirals, glowing faintly against the black smoke that rolled over the horizon. Edrin Cole stood at the edge of the last field, his boots sinking into damp soil as he watched chunks of the Starfall wreck break apart in the upper atmosphere. They fell like dying stars, trailing orange fire, and the air trembled with each distant impact. Lyrics clung to his arm, silent but alert. The child's eyes, those strange, luminous orbs, reflected the raining sparks as if catching every fragment of the dying heavens. The acrid scent of burning alloy and scorched grain filled Edrin's lungs, and with every breath, he tasted the war that had finally reached Veyra Prime. A shard of metal the size of a wagon wheel screamed overhead and buried itself in the far end of the field, sending up a plume of dirt and embers. The rain of cinders was relentless, each flake of ash warm against Edrin's weathered skin. He crouched instinctively, pulling Lyrics down with him as another fragment punched into the soil not 20 paces away, hissing where it met the damp earth. The familiar rhythm of farm life, wind in the stalks, hum of the irrigation pumps was gone. Now there was only the distant roar of engines and the faint, mournful creak of flaming debris settling in the fields. In that moment, the last field felt like a graveyard for a planet that had once been alive. Lyrics tugged at his sleeve, and Edrin followed the child's gaze. Beyond the smoke, the horizon glowed with fires that marked where other ships had fallen. Ashfall Hamlet was somewhere under that haze, a cluster of lives too small to matter to Kryn Dominion or Terran Vanguard. He wondered if anyone else had seen this apocalypse descending, or if they were already buried under it. A sudden gust carried the metallic tang of ozone, and Edrin realized his Helios pulse rifle was still slung across his back. For the first time, it felt like more than just a precaution. He shifted his grip on Larix, heart hammering as the fields crackled with distant explosions. "This is no place for us anymore," he muttered under his breath, but the words were swallowed by the wind. Above, another fragment streaked down, turning night into a brief, violent day. Edrin's farmhouse loomed in the distance, barely visible through the ash. He took a slow, deliberate breath and pulled Larix toward shelter. Behind them, the rain of cinders fell heavier, hissing and spitting like the last breath of a dying world. The war had arrived, and Driftplane Fields would never be the same. Edrin. Cole stared at the blackened horizon, ash clinging to his hair and shoulders. The rain of cinders hadn't stopped, and the acrid wind carried the distant rumble of destruction rolling across Veyra Prime. He crouched behind the charred remains of an irrigation pump, lyrics pressed against his chest, and for the first time, since the war had come to his farm, a single, sharp thought cut through the haze of fear. They couldn't hide here anymore. The last field had been his entire life, a patch of land where he and his late wife had sown grain, raised livestock, and hoped for peace. But now the soil was pocked with smoldering craters, the air poisoned by Kryn wreckage. He glanced toward his farmhouse, its tin roof half melted by falling fragments, and knew it was no fortress. The war wasn't passing over anymore. It had settled on top of him. He tightened his hold on Larix. The child's strange eyes glimmered, reflecting the thin beams of light that pierced the smoke. There was no fear in them, only a quiet, unnerving awareness, as if Larix already understood. The choice Edrin was about to make. "We can't stay, kid," he whispered, voice cracking against the wind. "Not here. Not anymore." The words made it real. He would leave Driftplane Fields, abandon everything he had built, and venture into the unknown to protect a child who wasn't even fully human. It should have felt like betrayal, but instead, it felt like the only thing that mattered. He moved quickly, instincts taking over. First, he returned to the farmhouse, slipping through the doorway that sagged on one hinge. Inside, the familiar scent of earth and old wood was laced with smoke. He grabbed a weathered pack and began stuffing it with essentials: dried grain, a canteen, a med kit, and a small bundle of cloth he could use to wrap Larix against the ash. His Helios pulse rifle went across his shoulder, its weight grounding him. In the corner, a glimmer caught his eye. The ether beacon he'd scavenged from the Starfall wreck, still dormant. He hesitated, then tucked it into the pack. If the Convergence had built this child, maybe the device would help him understand who or what was hunting them. Edrin led Larix into the barn, which still stood despite a blackened roof beam groaning above them. His old hovercart hummed to life, low and uneven, the engine choking on ash. It wasn't built for speed, but it was all they had. He wiped a streak of grime from his brow, forcing calm into his voice. "We head for Ashfall Hamlet first," he said, mostly to himself. "If anyone's left, maybe they'll help." Larix tilted his head, as if listening to something distant and invisible. For a brief moment, Edrin swore he saw the child's expression harden, not with fear, but with the gravity of someone who already understood war. The wind howled, carrying with it the metallic whine of distant engines. Edrin's stomach turned to stone. The Strykar drones would return, and next time hiding under floorboards wouldn't be enough. He secured Larix in the cart, wrapped in a blanket against the ash, and climbed into the seat. For one last time, he glanced back at the last field. Once golden and alive, it now looked like the grave of a planet that had never truly had a chance to stay free. With a flick of the controls, the hovercart hummed forward, gliding toward the open expanse of drift plain fields. Edrin Cole did not look back again. The hovercart floated over the uneven soil, leaving a faint trail through the ash that had turned drift plain fields into a gray ocean. Edrin Cole kept his eyes on the horizon, where the skeletal remains of Ashfall Hamlet barely pierced the haze. The sky still burned in pockets, streaked with the embers of distant battles, and every gust of wind carried the metallic tang of war. Lyric sat bundled in a tattered blanket beside him, silent, but those luminous eyes tracked every flicker of light and shadow. Edrin felt the child's small fingers tighten around his sleeve whenever the wind howled too sharply or a fragment of smoldering wreckage crashed in the distance. They were halfway across the last field when the hovercart jolted. Edrin instinctively pressed the throttle to steady it, but then he saw movement ahead, just beyond a charred cluster of irrigation pipes. A silhouette staggered into view. He froze. It was tall, easily 7 feet, its outline jagged and wrong, backlit by the faint glow of drifting embers. As it lurched closer, the details emerged. A Kryn Dominion warrior, its exoskeletal armor cracked and smoking, one arm dragging a long-bladed plasma spear through the dirt. A gash across its shoulder oozed iridescent fluid that hissed where it touched the hot soil. "Damn," Edran whispered, heart hammering. The warrior was injured but not dead. Worse, it wasn't alone in its suffering. Its helmet's half-shattered optics still pulsed with light, scanning. Even wounded, a Kryn soldier was lethal. And if this one was alive, others could be nearby. Edrin's first instinct was to veer, the cart around, but the ground was uneven, littered with blackened debris. The hovercart wasn't built for sharp maneuvers, and any sudden movement might draw attention faster. He glanced at Lyrics. The child's face was still, but their strange eyes were fixed on the alien, unblinking, almost connecting. The Kryn warrior paused, then lifted its head with a jerking motion, its gaze locked onto the cart. Even through the fractured helmet, Edrin felt the weight of that stare, cold, assessing, and full of a predator's resolve. The alien let out a guttural hiss, then staggered toward them, dragging the plasma spear, leaving a glowing furrow in the ash. "Hold on," Edrin muttered, gripping the controls. He pushed the hovercart forward, slow at first, trying to glide past without provoking it. But Lyrics suddenly leaned forward, eyes wide, not in fear, but in some instinctual response. A soft sound escaped their throat, not quite human, not quite alien. The warrior froze. It tilted its head, as if recognizing the voice, or the presence behind it. A warbling, broken sound answered from its throat, filled with static undertones. Edrin's stomach knotted. They were communicating. The moment shattered when the warrior staggered closer, spear raised with its good arm. Injured or not, it was. About to strike, Edrin's hand shot to the Helios pulse rifle slung over his shoulder. He swung it up, thumbed the charge, and a low hum filled the air. "Stay back!" he barked, even knowing the words meant nothing. The Kryn lunged. Instinct took over. Edrin fired. A bolt of blue energy slammed into the alien's chest plate, spinning it sideways. The warrior crashed into the dirt, its spear clattering away. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the cart's engine and Edrin's ragged breathing. Then came a rasping inhale. The alien wasn't dead. Its fingers clawed at the soil, trying to rise. "Damn it," Edrin muttered. He wanted to finish it. But Lyrics made another sound, softer this time, almost pleading. The child's hand pressed against his arm, shaking their head. Edrin hesitated. The weight of that alien gaze and the child's silent plea pinning him in place. He didn't understand it, but he could feel it. Lyrics didn't want this being dead. The warrior slumped back to the ground, armor sparking, and for a moment the war seemed to pause. Smoke curled around them, and the distant hum of Strykar drones drifted closer with the wind. Edrin gritted his teeth. He couldn't stay here. He revved the hovercart forward, skirting the fallen alien, never looking back. Yet even as they glided toward the ruins of Ashfall Hamlet, he felt those alien eyes, half shuttered, but alive, burning into his memory. The war wasn't just above them anymore. It was here, in the fields, in the soil, in the choices he made to protect this strange child. And he had a sinking feeling that sparing that warrior would come back to haunt him, or save him. The wind howled across drift-plain fields, scattering ash into ghostly spirals as Edrin Cole hauled the old hover harvester out of the barn. Its green paint was streaked with soot, the panels scarred from years of hard seasons. Tonight, it was no longer a farm tool, it was his last line of defense. Lyrics crouched in the passenger nook, small hands gripping the edge, those glowing eyes never leaving the barn's splintered doorway. Beyond it, in the open fields, the war was creeping closer. The rain of cinders had thickened, fragments of the Starfall wreck landing in fiery arcs, hissing as they struck the soil. Somewhere out in that haze, the injured Kryn warrior still hunted. Edrin gritted his teeth and pushed the harvester's throttle forward. The repulsors hummed, lifting the heavy machine over the ash-coated ground. Every vibration rattled his bones. They didn't get far. From the veil of smoke, a shadow emerged, then two more. The first figure limped heavily, dragging a plasma spear. The other two were smaller, streetcar drones, their spherical bodies bristling with sensors and thin-bladed legs for traversing the terrain. Their optical strips glowed red as they locked onto the hover harvester. Hell, Edrin muttered, gripping the control levers. He could feel his pulse in his fingertips. The injured warrior let out a guttural sound and pointed its spear at him. The drones split, circling wide, their scanners flickering. The hum of their engines resonated in Edrin's chest. He didn't have a plan, just instinct. He jammed the throttle, and the harvester lunged forward. Its wide, cutting blades, still smeared with old crop residue, whirred to life. The first drone darted toward the cockpit, firing a burst of plasma. Edrin jerked the machine to the side. The shot scorched a black line across the hull. Sparks danced in the night. Lyrics let out a sharp gasp, but didn't scream. "Hang on!" Edrin roared. He swung the harvester toward the closest drone. The machine's spinning blades caught the spherical body with a metallic shriek, slicing it into sparking halves that tumbled into the soil. The Kryn warrior roared, an inhuman metallic echo. It lunged forward, despite its wound, the spears, tip flaring with plasma. Edrin veered left, the harvester's heavy frame groaning. The second drone dove low, firing again. A blast rocked the undercarriage, shaking dust and ash from the roof. Lyrics pressed their small hands to the control panel. For a heartbeat, Edrin thought they were scared, but then the child's ether beacon pulsed, emitting a soft, rhythmic glow. The remaining drone faltered, its optical strip flickering in confusion. Edrin didn't hesitate. He swung the harvester around in a tight, grating turn. The cutting blades roared, clipping the second drone and sending shards of its body spinning into the dark. The injured warrior was only a dozen feet away now. Edrin could see the fractured plates of its armor, the shimmer of alien blood, the way its eyes burned with both fury and something else. Recognition? Desperation? He didn't have the luxury to find out. The harvester surged forward, the Kryn leapt, spear raised high. For one surreal instant, man, machine, and alien collided under the raining cinders. The spear scraped across the harvester's roof, carving a molten line, but the machine's sheer mass sent the warrior sprawling. Edrin spun the harvester, bringing the blades around. He hesitated. Lyrics was watching. The child's eyes glowed brighter, silently pleading, not in fear, but in something far more complicated. Mercy? The alien tried to rise again, its movements jerky, broken. The war in the sky raged, but here, in the last field, time slowed. Edrin knew he could end it now. Instead, he slammed the side of the harvester into the warrior, sending it tumbling into a shallow irrigation trench. Its spear clattered out of reach. The alien lay still, chest. Heaving, beaten but alive, Edrin exhaled hard, his hands trembling on the controls. He backed the harvester away, the blades dripping with ash, and pointed toward the distant glow of Ashfall Hamlet. "Hold on, kid," he murmured, his voice rough. "We're not safe yet." Lyrics pressed their small hand against the window, watching the fallen warrior fade into the smoke. The hum of the harvester drowned out the battlefield, but Edrin couldn't shake the feeling that the war had already followed them into their hearts. The hover harvester glided through the drifting veil of ash, its repulsors whining softly against the charred wind. Edrin Cole's hands were stiff on the controls, his knuckles white, while Lyrics huddled beside him, glowing eyes reflecting the fiery streaks in the sky. The rain of cinders had grown heavier, turning the world into a gray and red blur. Motes of burning metal hissed as they struck the harvester's hull. The smell of scorched earth and melting alloys clung to the air, thick and bitter. Ahead, the faint outline of Ashfall Hamlet emerged through the smoke. What had once been a quiet cluster of homes and market sheds now looked like a place abandoned by life itself. Roofs were caved in, walls blackened, and the central spire that had marked the settlement's meeting hall was snapped in half like a broken bone. Edrin slowed the harvester as they crossed the final ridge. His gut clenched. The scene below was a graveyard of light and shadow. Fires flickered in doorways and craters, the embers painting streaks of gold across the rain-slicked mud. And through the hiss of falling ash came the sound that made his chest tighten, distant cries for help, raw and wavering. He killed the engine and listened. The silence between the echoes was worse than the cries themselves. Somewhere in the ruin, survivors were trapped, but the air carried the smell of death. Lyrics pressed their small face to the cracked viewport, the glow in their eyes dimming as if the sight drained them. They turned to Edrin, and for the first time since he'd found the child in the Starfall wreck, he saw true fear. Not for themselves, but for the lives snuffed out around them. "We're too late," Edrin muttered, his voice barely carrying over the patter of ash, but he couldn't make himself believe it. He climbed down from the harvester, boots sinking into the soot-streaked mud, and felt the weight of the ether beacon pulsing faintly against his chest where Lyrics had pressed it into his hands. Every step toward the shattered hamlet was a fight, against the dread curling in his gut. The village paths were littered with shards of alien alloy, collapsed solar panels, and the charred remnants of what had been lives only a day ago. Then the wind shifted, and Edrin froze. A sound rose above the distant cries, low, mechanical, and rising. Engines. Lyrics tensed and grabbed his hand, their small fingers cold and trembling. Above the rolling ash clouds, the silhouettes of ships moved like predators circling a wounded animal. Edrin's heart pounded. He had thought he was running towards safety. Instead, he'd led them straight to the edge of hell. The rain of cinders fell harder, masking the world in smoke and fire as the war finally bled into Ashfall Hamlet. The silence that had fallen over drift plain fields felt almost merciful. Edrin Cole leaned against the charred frame of an abandoned grain shed, his hands trembling as Lyrics huddled against his chest. The storm of ash from the last battle had finally thinned, and for the first time in days, the horizon of Veyra Prime looked calm. He wanted, desperately, to believe they were safe. Then the sky tore open. It began with a low vibration, a thrumming that shook the soil beneath his boots. The birds that had returned to Ashfall Hamlet's outskirts vanished in an instant, fleeing in frantic arcs. Edrin raised his eyes just as the clouds split with a fiery shimmer. Dozens, No, hundreds of vessels emerged, blotting out the twin suns. A massive hulk led the formation, bristling with weapons and glowing with the ominous crimson of the Kryn Dominion. Surrounding it, sleek Terran vanguard cruisers broke the clouds like hunters encircling prey. Lyric stirred in his arms, small, fingers tightening against Edrin's coat. His luminous eyes caught the first reflections of the descending fleet, wide with an instinctual fear. "They found us," Edrin whispered, his voice rasping like gravel in his throat. Engines roared overhead, and the air smelled of scorched ozone. A distant explosion rolled across the plains as one of the Dominion warships released a barrage into the hills, testing its might, asserting dominance. The ground seemed to breathe with each impact, sending up bursts of ash that shimmered in the light. The last field, his last refuge, felt suddenly smaller than a coffin. From behind the silhouette of the lead carrier, a new shape emerged. An orbital sweeper, its underbelly lined with rotating cannons and scanning arrays. Its lights flickered in rhythmic pulses, casting long streaks of blue across the fields. Edrin's gut clenched. He knew that light. He had seen it in his nightmares. Striker drones called to their masters. Lyric shivered. The ether beacon at his neck gave off a faint hum, a warning Edrin didn't understand but felt in his bones. He crouched lower behind the broken fencing, the memory of war clawing at his mind. There was no safe place now. The fleet hadn't just come to search. It had come to finish what the war had started. Above, the two factions circled each other like predators, the Dominion fleet looming dark and vengeful, the vanguard holding the line of survival. All it would take was one spark, one trigger, and Veyra Prime would burn. Edrin held Lyrics closer, heart hammering against the child's small frame. For a fleeting moment, the boy looked up at him, his alien glow reflected in Edrin's eyes. He realized with a jolt that this child, this fragile, miraculous being, might be the only reason the skies hadn't already opened fire. And then, with a final roar of engines, the first dropships began their descent. The first rumble of cannon, fire shattered the illusion of safety. Adrian Cole didn't wait for the second. He tightened his grip on Lyrics' hand and sprinted across the ashen fields, boots sinking into soft soil darkened by weeks of rain of cinders. Shards of old glass crunched underfoot as he reached the abandoned greenhouse at the edge of drift plain fields, a relic from a time when Ashfall Hamlet had been alive with harvests, not ghosts. The glass house was mostly intact, though entire. Panes had melted into strange, warped shapes from past skirmishes. Edrin shoved the crooked door open and guided Lyrics inside. Dust and the scent of old soil filled the air. Rows of long-dead vines drooped from rusted wires and shattered hydroponic trays lay strewn across the floor. "Stay low," Edrin murmured, pulling the boy into the shadow of a collapsed irrigation table. Lyrics nodded, his eyes still glowing, faintly, reflecting the flashes of battle outside. Through the fractured glass walls, the sky raged. Terran vanguard cruisers had formed a defensive arc, their silver hulls catching the dim sun, while the darker, jagged ships of the Kryn Dominion moved like hunting beasts flanking the human fleet. Bolts of plasma slashed through the clouds, leaving trails of fire that lit the greenhouse in eerie pulses. Then the first collision came. A Dominion destroyer cut low across the horizon, strafing the fields with laser fire. Soil erupted in molten fountains. One bolt struck a distant silo, which burst into a bloom of flame and ash, sending a rain of burning chaff tumbling onto the last field. Edrin clenched his teeth, feeling the vibration travel up his spine. He had seen battles before, back in the early days when the Convergence Project was whispered about but not yet feared, but never this close. Never where he could smell the metal and scorched earth. Lyrics' small fingers brushed against his, trembling. The boy's gaze was fixed upward, tracking the movement of the ships with unnatural precision, as if he could feel each shift in their formation. A sudden metallic screech cut through the chaos. A Terran frigate spiraled out of control, engines on fire, scattering debris across the fields. One jagged hunk of metal punched through the greenhouse roof, embedding itself into the soil inches from Edrin's foot. He bit down a curse and pressed Lyrix tighter against him. The air was electric with tension. Flashes of light turned the glass house into a strobe-lit nightmare. Each volley of fire from above reflected in the warped glass like the sky itself was breaking. Edrin forced himself to breathe, to think. This was no longer about hiding. The war had come to Veyra Prime's heart, and the fragile glass house was nothing but a pause between storms. Outside, the sound of engines shifted, deeper, more resonant. Dropships were landing. Soldiers or hunters would soon sweep the fields. And in his gut, Edrin knew the real danger wasn't the battle above. It was what would come crawling through the soil once the ships had chosen their prey. The greenhouse trembled with every distant impact, but for a fleeting moment, Edrin Cole believed they might go unnoticed. He crouched beside Lyrix, his hand wrapped protectively around the boy's shoulder, while the distant roars of war faded into a tense hum. Then, something changed. Lyrix stiffened. His luminous eyes dilated, catching a soft glint of light that wasn't from the battle outside. The ether beacon around his neck began to thrum, a faint vibration traveling through the boy's body into Edrin's palm. "Lyrix," Edrin whispered, his voice dry as sand. "What's happening?" The boy didn't answer. His gaze drifted, skyward, through the warped glass of the greenhouse, toward the warring fleets. A low resonance filled the air, like the breath of the planet itself. Then, without warning, the beacon flared to life. A pillar of soft, pearlescent energy burst. Upward, piercing the cracked roof of the greenhouse. It was silent, invisible to human ears, yet Edrin felt it ripple through his bones. Outside, the war paused. The sound of engines dulled to a cautious hum. Kryn Dominion destroyers and Terran Vanguard cruisers hovered mid-maneuver, as if caught, in an unspoken truce. Even the falling embers seemed to hesitate, suspended in the air like glimmers of frozen rain. Edrin's heart pounded. He peeked through a jagged window to see entire squadrons holding position. The largest Dominion dreadnought shifted its prow toward the last field, its black armor reflecting the pale light of Lyrix's signal. Moments later, a human battleship mirrored the motion, weapons still armed but unmoving. The beacon pulsed, again slower this time. Lyrix's lips parted, and a strange hum rolled out, a blend of human tone and alien resonance. It wasn't speech, not in any language Edrin knew, but the intent was clear. A plea, a warning, a presence declaring itself to the heavens. Then, from the clouds, a response. One by one, the fleet's weapons dimmed, power cores cycling into standby. The high-pitched whine of the Strykar drones ceased as they hovered motionless above the fields. The battlefield had become a cathedral of silence, broken only by the whisper of falling ash. Edrin exhaled slowly, fighting to steady his shaking hands. The boy was no longer just a survivor. He was a key, a living signal woven into the very war that had torn Veyra Prime apart. He watched Lyrix's expression shift, pain and focus battling in his features. Beads of sweat rolled down the boy's temple, and his glow flickered with each breath. Edrin could only hold him, helpless against the magnitude of whatever he had awakened. Above them, two fleets faced each other across the sky like predators, forced to acknowledge a higher law. For the first time in weeks, the air was free of gunfire. "Easy, kid," Edrin muttered, voice trembling as he brushed soot from Lyrix's cheek. "Just hang on." but deep in his gut, he knew the stillness wouldn't last. This was a pause, a single heartbeat in the war. Somewhere above, the leaders of both species were already deciding what the signal meant: mercy or annihilation. Edrin swallowed hard, staring up at the suspended storm, and realized that his world now turned on the will of a child who barely knew his own power. The silence over driftplane fields felt wrong. It wasn't peace, it was the inhale before the strike. Edrin Cole crouched among the broken glass and vines of the abandoned greenhouse, his arm locked protectively around Lyrics, watching the sky split open. From the clouds, a single vessel descended. It wasn't the largest ship in the Kryn Dominion. Fleet, but its presence commanded attention. Sleek, black, and bristling with living metal spines, it resembled a predator gliding toward its prey. Its engines purred like some massive, restrained beast. The lower hull opened, and a shimmering beam of light cascaded to the ground, scattering ash in every direction. "Stay behind me," Edrin whispered, even though he knew it was pointless. If they wanted him dead, no wall of vines would save them. From the light, a figure emerged. At first glance, it was humanoid. Tall, silver-skinned, with patterns across the face that pulsed like breathing veins of light. Its eyes were amber, too steady, too knowing. Edrin felt a cold weight settle in his chest. This wasn't just a soldier. It was a voice of authority. "Terran," the figure said, and the sound wasn't spoken so much as etched into the air. It resonated in his bones, bypassing his ears entirely. "You shelter the Convergence child." Edrin swallowed. His throat felt raw. "He's a kid. He's not a weapon." The alien tilted its head, studying him like one might study a curious insect. Then, slowly, its gaze lowered to Lyrics, whose luminous eyes reflected both fear and defiance. "The hybrid holds the key," the alien intoned. "His signal has stayed our fleet. By his pulse, the war halts. For now." Lyrics shivered, clutching the ether beacon at his chest. Edrin could feel the boy trembling against his side, yet there was a flicker of something in him. Resolve, as if some instinct whispered that this moment was his to face. "I won't hand him over," Edrin said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice. "I've seen what your war does. He deserves a chance to live, to choose his own path." The alien's expression did not change, yet its presence grew heavier, as though the weight of judgment pressed down on the farmer's shoulders. "Choice," it repeated, tasting the word. "You misunderstand, Terran. The Convergence children are the axis of survival. If he bonds to the Dominion, your kind will live beneath our shield. If he bonds to your vanguard, we will see your species burn before allowing your experiments to multiply." Lyrics made a soft sound, almost like a whimper. His eyes locked onto Edrin's, pleading for answers he could not give. Edrin clenched, his jaw. He had been a man of the soil all his life. His battles fought against seasons and storms. Now he stood in the crosshairs of empires. "There has to be another way," he said, voice low but steady. "He's just a boy. He didn't ask for this war." The alien crouched, bringing its glowing eyes level with Lyrics's face. For a heartbeat, the field was silent, save for the distant hiss of falling ash. "Then the boy must decide," the alien said at last. "Life or death, union or extinction." The beam of light hummed louder, and the figure straightened, glancing skyward. The fleets above shifted slightly, restless. Edrin tightened his hold on Lyrics, his heart hammering. He didn't know how a child could make such a choice, or if he would even be given the chance. But he felt, deep in his bones, that the next moment would decide the fate of more than just their lives. The rain of cinders had slowed to a delicate drift, each ember a fading memory of the war above. Edrin Cole staggered into the last field. the stalks of grain half-burned, shimmering, faintly under the glow of fire and ash. His arms cradled Lyrics against his chest, feeling the boy's quick, uneven breaths and the trembling heartbeat pressed to his ribs. The sky was a tapestry of shadow and smoke, slashed with streaks of orange from distant fires. Above, the fleets hovered in tense silence. The Kryn Dominion warships were like black blades slicing the clouds, while the Terran Vanguard vessels flared in silver defiance. Yet for the first time, they did not fire. Edrin sank to his knees among the charred stalks, clutching Lyrics closer. His hands were raw and blistered from the heat of the day, but he hardly felt it. The silence was louder than the war itself. Only the wind moved through the broken fields, carrying the soft, haunting echoes of distant cries, survivors calling, out to the ruins of Ashfall Hamlet. Lyrics stirred, his glowing eyes reflecting the dying light above. "They stopped," he whispered, voice thin but certain. Edrin followed the boy's gaze, and indeed, the largest Kryn battleship was turning. Away, then another. Slowly, deliberately, the fleet pulled back, leaving the heavens scarred but open. A final streak of fire crossed the sky as a smaller ship broke formation, vanishing into the horizon. "They're leaving us?" Edrin muttered, though he couldn't quite believe it. Lyrics rested his head on Edrin's shoulder. "They heard me," he said softly. I asked them to stop." Edrin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ash. This child, fragile and shaking in his arms, had just halted a war, or at least postponed it. He couldn't fathom the weight on those small shoulders. The farmer rose slowly, scanning the horizon. What remained of the settlement was barely recognizable. Scorched frames of homes, broken machinery, and the soft glow of smoldering wood. The land itself seemed wounded. He could taste the metal and ash on his tongue, bitter and dry. In the distance, a low rumble rolled through the fields, not of engines, but of the earth itself, unsettled by the day's violence. It reminded him that Veyra Prime had been there, home for generations, and that home now trembled on the edge of ruin. He looked down at Lyrics, whose face had gone still, as though listening to something Edrin could not hear. For the first time, he didn't see just a child. He saw the bridge between worlds, a fragile hope suspended between survival and destruction. As the last ship vanished into the bruised sky, Edrin exhaled, his breath catching in the cold air. "Whatever comes next, kid," he whispered, "we face it together." The ash swirled around them like a slow snowfall, carrying the scent of endings and the faintest whisper of beginnings. In that moment, beneath the broken sky of the last field, Edrin held the boy tight and wondered if this silence was a promise or a warning. And so, beneath the quiet sky of Veyra Prime, the farmer and the child stood in the last field. The war had paused, but not ended. Edrin Cole knew that tomorrow would bring new questions, and perhaps new battles. Yet in that fragile moment, as the ash drifted like snow, hope still lingered. A hope carried in the heartbeat of the boy, called Lyrics, the bridge between worlds. If you enjoyed this journey through the stars, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep and emotional sci-fi stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive.